How many of you have seen the movie Cat on a Hot Tin Roof? Okay, so I figured there would be quite a few here. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a pretty big classic. It's based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning play by Tennessee Williams, and it tells the story, as you could probably gather, of a rich and powerful man called Big Daddy. Big Daddy is the patriarch of the Pollitt family. He sort of reminds us, I'm going to move us a little bit later in movie cinema watching, he sort of reminds us of a mix between Cher's father in Clueless and Captain Barbossa from Pirates of the Caribbean. So he's the godfather, the king, the creator, the pirate. And he represents a version of the American dream, the rags to riches tale of a penniless young man who wanders around the country until he's hired as a field hand at a cotton plantation. He rises eventually to become the overseer of the plantation, finally the co-owner of the plantation, and ultimately he becomes the sole owner and manager of a huge piece of rich farmland. Now, Big Daddy is actually a lecherous, misogynist man. And from his conversation that we just saw with his son, Brick, we learn that Big Daddy has lived a life of lies, but that he's come to expect that lies are just a fact of life. He can't stand his wife. He loathes his grandchildren. He hates church. He abhors the clubs to which he belongs, the clubs that actually indicate and solidify his place in society. But at the same time he hates all that, he loves his place in society. He loves being the all-powerful ruler, lording over his treasures. He loves the fact that he has control over the riches that his heirs are scrambling to attain. That sounds a lot like our story of the rich man and his barns, doesn't it? Or does it? Because many of us who hear this parable, especially in our North American context, may wonder, why does Jesus call the rich farmer a fool? Because one could easily argue that the rich man is a wise and responsible person. He has a thriving farming business. His land has produced so abundantly that he doesn't have enough storage space in his barns. It sounds like 2 years of flea market. Amen? So he plans to pull down his barns and build bigger ones to store all of his grains and goods. Then he's going to have ample savings set aside for the future, and he will be all set to enjoy his golden years. Isn't that what we're all encouraged to strive for? Isn't it wise and responsible to save for the future? The rich farmer would probably be a great financial advisor because he seems to have things figured out. He's worked hard, he's saved wisely, he's grown his business, so now why can't he just sit back and relax and enjoy the fruits of his labor, right? Well, there's one very important thing that the rich man has not planned for: his reckoning with God. So God says to him, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be?" The rich farmer is a fool not because he's wealthy or because he saves for the future, but because he appears to live only for himself, and because he believes he can secure his life with his abundant possessions. You see, when the rich man talks in this parable, did you notice? He talks only to himself, and the only person he ever refers to is himself. What should I do? For I have no place for my crops. I will do this. I will pull down my barns and big larger ones, build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. The rich man's land produced abundantly, yet nowhere does he express any sense of gratitude to God or to the workers who have helped him plant and harvest his bumper crops. He has more grain and goods in storage than he could ever hope to use, yet seems to have no thought of sharing it with others and no thought of what God might require of him. He is blind to the fact that his life is not his own to secure, that his life belongs to God, and that God can demand it back at any time. The rich man learns the hard way what the writer of Ecclesiastes realized. Quite simply, you can't take it with you. All that we work so hard for in life will end up in someone else's hands. And as Ecclesiastes puts it, who knows whether they will be wise or foolish? Yet they will be master of all for which I have toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. Another word that can be translated vanity is emptiness. And I'm guessing that we have all experienced, to some degree or other, that feeling that washes over us when we are actually enticed by materialism. And our reality is that no matter how much we have, we are always aware of what we don't have. And we, friends, we are bombarded by marketing wizards whose job it is to convince us of all the products that we need to complete our lives. And so we never feel that we have quite enough. Like the rich farmer, we're tempted to think that having large amounts of money and possessions stored up will make us secure. I mean, haven't all of us at some point or another said, if I only had? Sooner or later, however, we learn that no amount of wealth or property can secure our lives. No amount of wealth can protect us from a genetically inherited disease, for example, or from a tragic accident. No amount of wealth can keep our relationships healthy and our families from falling apart. In fact, the truth is that wealth and property can easily drive a wedge between family members, as in the case of the brothers who are fighting over their inheritance at the beginning of this text, which leads Jesus to tell this parable. And most importantly, no amount of wealth can secure our lives to God. In fact, Jesus repeatedly warns that wealth can actually get in the way of our relationship with God. Take care, he says. Be on guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in abundance of possessions. Now, it's not that God doesn't want us to save for retirement or for our future needs. It's not that God doesn't want us to eat and drink and be merry and enjoy what God has given us. I mean, we know from the Gospels that Jesus spent time eating and drinking with people and enjoying life. But he was also perfectly clear about where his true security lay. It's all about priorities. It's about who God truly is in our lives. It's about how we invest our lives and the gifts that God has given us. It's about how our lives are fundamentally aligned toward ourselves and our passing desires. I mean, how many of you want today what you wanted 20 years ago? Our priorities change, right? Or is our life focused toward God and our neighbor, toward God's mission to bless and redeem the world? A seasoned pastor once said, "I have heard many different regrets expressed by people nearing the end of life, but there is one regret I have never heard expressed. I have never heard anyone say, 'I wish I hadn't given so much away. I wish I had kept more for myself.'" Death, or impending death, has a way of clarifying what really matters. You see, our lives, our possessions, they're not our own. They belong to God. We're merely stewards of them for the time that God has given us here on this earth. And friends, we rebel against that truth because we all want to be in charge of our lives and our stuff. And yet, this truth is actually really good news because all that we are and all that we have belongs to God. Our future is secure beyond all measure. So Jesus tells us, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." So in that light, I love the story of a different family settlement of their estate. Again, it involves two brothers. The older brother is very rich. He had been successful in business and the world. Now, over the years, he had never married. He had very few friends because he spent all of his time working. The younger brother, on the other hand, he had a large family and many friends, and he worked hard but had very little to show for his work. It seemed as though between his family and helping his friends, his money went just barely far enough. One day, both men got word that their father had died, and the land that was the family farm had to be divided between the two brothers equally. So they both went to stay at their father's house while they tended to the various matters and arrangements of their father's affairs. And after their father had been buried, surveyors came and marked the land to allow for equal distribution. One night, the older brother was lying in bed, and he thought about his younger brother and how poor he was. With his big family, he certainly could use some extra income. So he thought, "I'm rich. I have plenty. I will go out in the dark of the night and move the marker that divides the farm in half, giving him the bigger portion of the farm." Meanwhile, the younger brother was also lying in bed and thinking about his older brother and how alone he was without family and friends. And he thought about how blessed he was to have a large family and so many friends. So he thought, all my brother has to remind him of his family is this piece of land. So I will go out in the middle of the night and move the marker further on my side so that he might have the bigger piece of land. That night, in the middle of their father's fields, the brothers met. And when each heard what the other brother was doing, they embraced and wept. Years later, an obscure legend has it, the city of Jerusalem was built upon the spot where their tears had fallen. Priorities. When we get our priorities right, we tend to find contentment and joy in our lives. And we let God work within us, much like a pumpkin that's about to become a jack-o'-lantern. I mean, you've got it, right? You pick out your pumpkin. There's always some imperfection in it, and you begin to imagine what that face could look like using that very imperfection in your creative design. So you draw a face on it, and then the messy work begins. You open it up, and you begin to scoop out all that nasty, slimy, smelly stuff inside. And if you like roasted pumpkin seeds like I do, you try to separate those from the globs of slime. And if you are especially gifted, you get a pumpkin pie out of it as well. But then you begin to carve out the design, which, if pumpkins could feel, would no doubt cause quite a bit of pain. Ultimately, you replace all those messy innards with a light that shines from within. A simple light that makes people smile and radiates joy. Our gathering song for this series is the well-known Shaker song, Simple Gifts. This song was actually sung by Shakers as the people danced and worshiped. I can just see your all's faces if I said, now's the time for us to dance at the beginning of worship, but that was their way of expressing joy in the lifestyle that they had chosen, and it captures this invitation to simplicity, which leads to both joy and contentment. So throughout this series, we'll focus on how to simplify our lives, how to better enjoy what we have and give more generously, how to handle our money and our possessions in the way that God intends, in such a way that we find joy. How fun is that going to be? And all God's people said,